I'm Tim Weaver from CMUG and I'm here with Dan Dawkins. How you doing, Dan?
Good morning, guten Tag.
Guten Tag indeed. So here we have The Last of Us. For me, probably the most impressive game at the show. I know that there were games that were sporting next-gen graphics, but this was just amazing, I thought. Dan, tell us about it. You've seen rather a slightly different version than the one we're going to see today.
Yeah, I, like you, was pretty wowed by this at the Sony E3 press conference, and it was the one thing that made me leave Sony feeling pretty positive. And I was also taken by the fact that of all the games at E3 that traded in relentless, non-stop, bang-bang violence, this was the one that made violence feel violent.
Yeah.
And by juxtaposing it with what we can see here, and that's a genuinely sort of beautiful and oddly tranquil world.
It looks amazing.
Just a quick thing to add, I played an alternative version of this demo. I didn't play it, I saw it being played by Naughty Dog. And it's interesting that in the alternative demo, they did press triangle to view that poster. And an alternative dialogue tree plays out between Joel and Ellie, where she goes, "Hey, what's that?" And he goes, "Oh, it's just some crappy slasher flick." And there's a little bit of backstory about it. And eventually she says, "Hey Joel, who did you go to see that with?" And he just sort of harumphs and goes, "It doesn't matter, let's press on."
Interesting.
And it's a really nice bit of character background. And throughout the game there'll be little moments like that dotted through. Also seeing the alternative demo live, it's really, you absorb the ambience of the game and you realise that it's just genuinely beautiful. And the way the soft light fizzles through, the way the foliage is hanging and gently rocks, the birds tweeting. There's this sense of almost is nature is trying to reclaim the beauty of the world after this incident has happened with the infected fungus, and man has become the violator.
Yeah.
And Joel's actions, are startlingly brutal, as we'll see later on.
Yeah. But you raise an interesting point, and we discussed it quite a lot in the office. In that the violence in this feels so, for want of a better word, visceral, because the run up to it is so quiet, like you say. I mean, it's very. I mean, Naughty Dog have really captured that kind of celluloid kind of feel, the feel of a really high quality film, because that is what you get in films. You get this, the peaks and troughs, and they work those peaks and troughs so well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's loud because it gets quiet, and I think they do that better than anyone. Also in this section, what we're seeing here in the alternative playthrough, he went straight up the ladder and is taking these steps. In the alternate playthrough, they scrambled around to find a ladder in a different zone, and he ends up boosting Ellie up a ledge, and she throws the ladder down to him, and then he actually manually carries about and plonks it down.
Right. So how different is the different playthrough then? Is it like, we're not talking about it taking you off in vastly different directions? We're just talking about it slightly altering your gameplay experience?
Yeah, the way I asked Naughty Dog this, saying, is it actually a branching route through the game, or is it essentially the same? And what they said was that they described the game as wide linear, as in there's one essential narrative through it, but there's different approaches to it and different things you can unlock and see by taking different paths. So for example, whilst now we've ended up in the place, this is literally the E3 press conference demo, we'd have got there but by performing different actions in the alternative demo. And this is the E3 press conference demo. It's the quite explodey, violent version of this takedown of the survivors. But in the version I saw, it was a much more stealthy takedown.
Yeah.
Where in that window he just approached by a minute ago, he didn't dive through this window on the right. He shuffled to the window on the left, and on the way picked up a bottle he found on the floor. Then what he did was lob the bottle through the window, and the guards, you hear them go, "What was that? Was it rats?" And they sort of shuffle along to find it.
Oh, interesting.
And the demo takes an entirely different route, where, well, not entirely different, but instead of sort of here, like he's on the back foot because he's alerted the guards to him being there, if you take a stealthy route, you sort of become the hunter, not the hunted.
Yeah.
And you pick the guys off one by one.
Right.
Where what we're seeing here is him essentially like scrapping for survival.
Yeah.
Having alerted the guards to it.
But what's great is, and we alluded to it earlier, is just how dangerous this feels. Like it's really like you see, edge of your seat stuff here, because it is every single firefight, every single confrontation in this game is going to feel like a proper fight for survival. Even when he was choking that guy out earlier, it felt like, I imagine, it feels to choke a guy out, like both of you fighting for your very existence, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's actually quite interesting is that whilst this looks quite automated in terms of the way it's working, like you think, well, how do you take that guy prisoner? There is a button press thing that will activate that, so you have got a degree of quite tight control. Also, it's the way the violence is portrayed is through the dialogue. Like when you grab a guy, he'll breathe heavily and mutter and go "Whoa," and struggle, and it's that real sense of, you know, how characters would react in those situations. It's also coming from, like, Ellie stays largely out of scene here, and while she's, like, I suppose to an extent an innocent, she again will do what it takes to survive, and she's the one bailing you out there by lobbing the bottle. But like here, you can see that contextual animation of him slapping the guy's face on there. Ellie will react to the brutality that you've committed, so she might see something you've done and just be like, like shocked, genuinely surprised at this guy she's having to trust.
So you chatted to Kojima at the show, and he was genuinely intrigued as to how that sort of contextual stuff worked. And I think in your story for CMVG you referred to them as secret punch lasers. Maybe you can expand a bit more on that.
Yeah, I mean, Kojima, I'd spoken to Kojima the day before, and he'd expressed that he thought this was the biggest surprise to the Sony conference. And I think he'd sort of said, and I've got to be careful, you know, it's subject to translation, but he'd said he was intrigued in how they did it, as in how they created the gap between control and the computer taking over. And he seemed to be genuinely fascinated technically how they performed it. So then it came to light that the day after I'd spoken to him, Ethan Wells on Twitter, who's the boss of Naughty Dog, had said Kojima had been to see them, as you suspected. But on the same day I'd seen Naughty Dog and just grabbed one of their guys ad hoc and said, well, how are you doing it? You know, how are you, like we see here, how are you creating these moments where the guys are wrestling for the shotguns? What decides how that happens? Is it scripted? Is it not? And what he basically said is that, you know, this engine they're working with is essentially something they've had going for 6 years. It's extremely mature.
Yeah.
It's been built up over 4 games. So when you throw a punch, what will happen is the minute you press a button, it fires a load of, like, invisible rays, or as I described them, lasers, into the world that will measure key points that it will contextually bring in different animations. So at any time it will be streaming 12 different animations off a disc or something, and it will just bring them in according to what's right at that time and the representative dialogue trees.
Okay, so it's pretty clever stuff.
Yeah, it's pretty clever stuff. You know, the game looks fantastic.